Hello, my name is Vernon. I'm a second year MBA student at GIBS in Johannesburg, and this reflective journal is part of my final submission as I near the end of my MBA journey. Um, and it looks back on the entrepreneurial stream specifically and all the lessons that I've learned over the last 12 months participating in this entrepreneurial stream. And I'll be sharing some of those shortly in terms of what really worked well for me, what stuck, um, what valuable lessons are there, what are my takes and interpretations on some of them, and where to from here for me. So we'll be following up shortly with an agenda, and then I'll get into the various topics of discussion. Let's first try and understand why why the entrepreneurial stream and what was the attraction for me when it became available from an alternative point of view to the traditional thesis. Now, looking back at my own personal history, I've been involved in two entrepreneurial stints, and very much as a late joining partner in a venture that was already running. So from my perspective, I've never truly experienced that startup from scratch type entrepreneurial journey. I've always joined companies well into their sort of stability stage. So for me, it was really about a personal discovery journey, about perhaps breaking that perception that I have in my own mind that um, this is a bit difficult and beyond my reach in terms of starting something from scratch. So it really was a journey of exploration, a journey to understand what it requires to start up a business. What does the word entrepreneurship mean? Um, what does that whole landscape look like? And how do other people who might be successful, how do they do this? How did they get to where they are today as entrepreneurs that started off from scratch and have built up big businesses and mega empires that stretch to all ends of the earth? So for me, it was really just an opportunity to reflect, an opportunity to utilize the time spent in the research project that could have a real personal impact and for myself and potentially have an impact for others in terms of job creation, job opportunities, career opportunities, and even shareholding opportunities. So that was, I think, the key driver for me is to really understand what are the characteristics, what drives entrepreneurship, what does a perfect entrepreneur look like, potentially break the myth that entrepreneurs are born and not made, um, and then to see how I could potentially scale and initiate a business that I started discovering over the first half of my journey, the PG dip, where as part of the applied business project, we stumbled on as a syndicate on a really great business idea, and I thought I'd use the opportunity to not only self-discover, but also look at how I can potentially, through the self-discovery, take this from idea to inception to scale to exit, and that is the journey. Right, let's compare the entrepreneurial landscape. Having spent 5 days in Israel now, I think we've got a good experience and an understanding of the entrepreneurial landscape within Israel. So we're going to compare that to what we have experienced in South Africa and the South African entrepreneurial landscape. The big marked difference between the two that I picked up was the scale and magnitude at which the Israeli entrepreneur thinks. One can possibly link that to the size of Israel as a country and the size of the target market potentially here. It's so small that it forces them to potentially think well outside the borders of Israel. And the second hindrance probably is the inability for them to trade with the immediate neighbors. Forces Israel to think well beyond the boundaries of the Middle East and to think at big markets like how do they conquer the United States, how do they conquer the Chinese market, and how do they scale their products to such a nature that they make them attractive for multinational corporates to buy out. So from a big picture point of view, the thinking in Israel most certainly is the world as a market, and not Israel or its immediate neighbors or perhaps the Middle East as a market. So the Israeli entrepreneur that we've encountered at all of these various startups we visited most certainly geared towards looking at the world as a target market. Looking at South Africa, I think we are very micro-focused in terms of how we view entrepreneurship. We sort of looking at how do I capture my immediate neighborhood, how do I make this thing scalable to capture the town that I live in, and to a certain extent there's some provincial type entrepreneurs who look to scale, and then there are a handful of nationals, but very few internationals, and on the rare occurrence there might be one or two global corporate buyouts, but as a norm, South African entrepreneurs tend to think very localized within the borders of South Africa, and very localized in terms of the area of influence, which generally seems to be sort of suburb and at best town based, and very different to the view of the Israeli entrepreneur that we encountered. Let's take a look at the different type of entrepreneurs we found in Israel over the last 5 days, and let's compare that to South Africa in terms of the types of entrepreneurs we find there. And I think I've used two definitions of entrepreneurship to try and categorize the two countries and explain the differences. The first type of entrepreneur is the necessity entrepreneur, who's pretty much driven by circumstance to enter the entrepreneurial space. So generally there's a lack of any other employment alternative, and they resort to a copy and paste type entrepreneurship, where they probably the most common format in South Africa is these little informal traders we tend to see along the side of the road, trying to etch out a living by selling to passers-by everyday commodities that are generally food-based. So that's your necessity type in entrepreneur, and then you get the opportunity type of entrepreneur, who identifies a need or a requirement in the market, be it a commodity, be it a solution, or be it a combination of the two, and then exploits that. I think that's the predominant form of entrepreneur we found here in Israel, is that it is an entrepreneur operating within that tech startup environment, which is pretty much focused around innovation, finding solutions predominantly in that technology type environment, and then also looking at making this thing extremely scalable on a global perspective. So the Israeli landscape very much dominated by the opportunity entrepreneur, and opportunity that is global, and opportunity that is focused towards technology across various sectors of the economy. So that is the second difference. Why are Israeli startups so successful? What puts them consistently in the top three when looking at startups, and startups per capita, and the number of startups reaching success critical mass, the number of startups being bought out by multinationals? What is it that makes Israel such fertile ground for entrepreneurs? And I think it's that favorite word of mine that has come out of this MBA journey, is that ecosystem that they've created here. It's most certainly an environment that enhances and stimulates that kind of thinking in terms of the entrepreneurial startup, and specifically the tech startup. And looking at the ecosystem they've created here, it's an involvement of multiple stakeholders, from these innovation hubs and incubators, these accelerators, these angel investors, venture capitalist companies and groupings, and there's an involvement of multinational corporates in this environment too. It's sort of been identified as a fertile breeding ground for good ideas, and these multinationals get involved because they find value out of the outputs of these startups. And as I mentioned earlier, there are many of these startups that have been bought out by multinationals and incorporated into their day-to-day operation. So it's potentially seen as an R&D center from a global corporate perspective, but just in a different format, utilizing these innovation hubs and incubators stationed all over Israel as a potential fertile R&D type environment. And coupled with that, we've got universities involved here in Israel, the government's involved. So it's most certainly a supporting and enhancing ecosystem which creates really great opportunities for entrepreneurs to take those risks, to engage in platforms where that out-of-the-box thinking, that solution thinking, the opportunity entrepreneur is able to function so effectively, and that puts that's one of the reasons that that Israel is at the forefront of startup success and generating awesome new solutions and ideas which are then scaled to the rest of the world. Right, let's take a look at what I've learned so far from what you've seen, and it's primarily focused around the experiences that we had in Israel, and I'd like to sum up those points again and put them into context of what I've learned subsequently to that in some of the outputs which were required post our global module. Now, the first critical element that arises out of the visit to Israel is that whole ecosystem, how the whole country is geared and built around stimulating and embracing entrepreneurship. Now, if one looks at the South African context where job creation is of critical importance, the role of the entrepreneur has a significant place in the future of South Africa and of how we're going to get this great country of ours back on track again. And poverty elimination is one of those critical elements. And through job creation, by the stimulation of entrepreneurship, there's most certainly a means to an end there. So from a entrepreneurship perspective and ecosystems, I don't think that that thing was quite hit home as significantly as when I did the consulting report with a little cake shop in a township called Kwatemania Springs. The shop was called Ikeke Shop. It was started by Ayanda Kaka, and it was started purely out of that term bricolage entrepreneurship, where Ayanda knew nothing about baking, and he embarked on this journey on the back of his first sales experience, which was his first job after dropping out of Technicon, after studying sound engineering there. Ayanda had this desire to be an entrepreneur first and foremost, and then searched for a need to satisfy. But if one, in the analysis of that business, it was quite significant to understand the lack of supporting infrastructure, the lack of supporting ecosystems in South Africa to stimulate that kind of entrepreneurship. Ayanda employs two other people, and he's been going for the last 5 years, and his future vision is to scale Ikeke to the point where he's able to franchise the whole Ikeke shop concept. But in the analysis there, it was significantly highlighted as to how short South Africa is in terms of that ecosystem. It also shows how different the mindsets are as a typical South African entrepreneur. He was one of the few that explored the need-satisfying entrepreneurship versus the necessity entrepreneur. And that's the reality of South Africa right now, is that not only don't we have an ecosystem that supports entrepreneurship, many people are driven to entrepreneurship purely because there's no other alternative income or revenue stream, and therefore they have to explore entrepreneurship as a means to an end, and many of them often earning very, very little, and many of those businesses doomed for failure well before they start. So from an ecosystem perspective, very much highlighted in the case of Ayanda and his business, and what his shortcomings there are in terms of support and structure and guidance to formalize the business. And I think that was the core in the context of my recommendation in the consulting report, is that I assist him in that journey to formalize the business, and hopefully through that create something which is scalable and it be part of what I see as my contribution to lifting as I rise out of the skills and knowledge obtained through the MBA. Also, a term that I mentioned earlier, the whole bricolage entrepreneurship, very much present again in Ayanda's case, where he sort of had to make do with what he had. And that's in essence what bricolage is. It's just making do with what you have instead of waiting for or generating a perfect environment. And I think that scrappy fight mindset is also what's potentially lacking in many South Africans in terms of the entrepreneurial space, is that everything has to be perfect and everything has to be right and in place, instead of let's get the thing going, let's make do with what we've got, and as we go along this journey and we feel our way down the path, we'll figure these things out and find ways of improving. And I think from a personal perspective, that's most certainly one of the elements that hit home to me, is that potentially where my shortcoming was, is that instead of taking the risk and instead of jumping in at the deep end, there was this perpetual wait for everything to be perfect. And I think the exact opposite of the whole bricolage entrepreneurship mentality. So that was a great valuable learning lesson for me out of my interaction with Ayanda and the Ikeke shop story, was that lack of ecosystem, and that almost it forces you into that bricolage entrepreneurship mindset, and it's something which doesn't come easily in South Africa, especially considering the transition from a fixed, stable, secure corporate type environment into that entrepreneurship environment where uncertainty is the only certainty. Maybe we're searching for too much. And maybe I can take a lesson out of Ayanda's story, where he knew nothing about baking, he had no experience in equipment, yet he ventured down that path. 5 years later, he's got a really successful business. I think that leads into the mindset and the focus and the vision of the Israeli people. And I think I can extrapolate that back into the South African context and even into the corporate environment context, where we've discovered the term corporate entrepreneurship through our journey of the MBA as well. But let's return to the Israeli mindset, a really thinking big mindset. It requires that entrepreneurial flair, but most certainly that paradox of adding in some sort of corporate rigidity in terms of scaling this thing globally. Because Israel is so small and there's not really a significant market that they can tap domestically, and their relationships with their neighbors is not really in a good place. So the Israelis are sort of forced to think well beyond their own borders and well beyond the Middle East to potentially scale any business idea to a point where it's profitable. And that sort of forces them to scale them to the extreme and look at the global scaling. So from a mindset perspective, significantly different. It forces them to think bigger, but I think it also then unlocks that paradox and introduces the term corporate entrepreneurship. So you need that entrepreneurial flair, you need that thinking out of the box, you need that search for that unknown demand, that search for a new need, and you got to sort of expand that, but within the corporate environment to make this thing scalable globally. And I think it's something which corporates are grappling at all the more in my own life in Bridgestone, South Africa. That's an element of the business which I am recognizing more and more and more is lacking in our day-to-day operation, and it's something which the company is striving to instill. However, that skill and that mindset is scarce, especially in the South African context, and most certainly in the corporate type environment where everything needs to work to structure, and um, if it's not structured, it sort of leaves many people uncertain, insecure, and potentially frustrated. So, from a corporate entrepreneurship mindset, global scaling point of view, significant difference between the South African and the Israeli mindsets. And I think South Africa has a way to go. Now, it is almost symptomatic one of the other. I think in the absence of a great ecosystem that enhances and stimulates entrepreneurship, we will never ever acquire that mindset to bridge that conundrum of corporate entrepreneurship and global thinking. Whereas in Israel, it's almost genetic. One could almost argue that it's genetic in the way it's just inborn and entrenched in any Israeli. But I think the circumstance and the environment and the ecosystem and uh, and the other success stories out of Israel, I think, stimulate that sort of motion and momentum that they have. So, some really valuable lessons that have come out of the interaction in Israel, and specifically that entrepreneurial type interaction when we did the consulting journal with Ayanda and his story around Ikeke Shop. Right, let's deep dive into some of the theories and theoretical models that we cross paths with, and I'll have a look at one or two of those that really stuck with me and had an impact. And the first one talks to the entrepreneurial mindset, and it sort of countered my initial thinking that you were born an entrepreneur. You either are or you're not an entrepreneur. These kinds of skills can't be learnt. And yeah, in our elective around advanced entrepreneurship, we were introduced to the metacognitive mindset model of entrepreneurship, and um, and that told us that potentially the entrepreneurial mindset is influenced, and it can be developed and made. And factors that influence that is experience and knowledge, but also the motivation of the individual. And I think there we talk to those two dynamics, whether it's a necessity entrepreneur and whether it's a need satisfying entrepreneur. Um, and I think then the environment also plays, the external environment also plays a role. So you see those four factors interacting with each other, that stimulates the way the entrepreneur or the individual thinks and evolves towards being an entrepreneur. So most certainly a bit of an eye-opener in terms of my initial thinking that entrepreneurship is inherent. You're born with it or you're not born with it. And I think the model of Haney, Shepard, Masakowski, and Early really has given me some new context. And if one looks at that in terms of the South African context again, knowledge, probably a fair amount of knowledge available, although significant disparities in our economic system and our schooling system. And this can lead to varying levels of knowledge, especially if one considers your necessity entrepreneur, who definitely does lack the knowledge element, which can sometimes bridge that lack of experience. Um, then we have a look at the experience side, and I think that's where a country like Israel, in terms of that environment in which they operate, um, there's so much experience around them, either learnt experience or experience you can acquire from other entrepreneurs to guide you through the process. Your motivation also very different. And there we talk to that again in the necessity versus the need satisfying entrepreneur, but also in terms of the scalability. What sort of motivation do we have as South African entrepreneurs where we're comfortable to have one sort of spa in our neighborhood and make a good living out of that, versus that Israeli motivation to take things global, because that scalability just doesn't exist within Israel. So that motivation and drive to take over the world, if you want to coin a phrase, most certainly inherent in the Israeli entrepreneurial environment. And then the external environment, and that talks to that ecosystem, and we'll talk a bit more about ecosystems later. But yeah, that talks to that ecosystem within which we operate and do business, and it could be the immediate economic or macroeconomic ecosystem, but also then within the industry and within the entrepreneurial mindset and within the entrepreneurial sector. All the factors like the incubators, startup hubs, angel investors, venture capitalists, ease of registration, and all of those barriers which can be eliminated or at least reduced in terms of barriers to entry, so that entrepreneurs can enter into this space and create that much needed employment and revenue within the South African context. So very much a mindset and an awareness point of view that is influenced by those external elements. And in essence, what Heine et al. Are saying is that entrepreneurship can be learnt and acquired. It doesn't necessarily have to be an inherent born-in trait, and that we can take an average person and empower him with all of those positive four elements, and it can generate a very successful entrepreneur. The second piece of theory I'm going to be discussing this afternoon as multiple legs by definition of what the theory is all about. But I'll try to tie in as broader and as a complex a view as possible of the South African landscape in and around entrepreneurship by embracing the theory around ecosystems and systems thinking within the entrepreneurial environment, and also in the greater South African business environment. Now, the ecosystem and the whole ecosystems theory is probably one of those key takeaway points for me from the MBA journey. And in essence, what that is sort of driving behavior towards in business of late is to view your organization not only as part of a relationship between your company and your customer base, or maybe your company and your suppliers, or maybe as within the presence of a specific sector or industry, like in the case of Bridgestone South Africa within the tire industry. It's a far wider view which we need to embrace in terms of viewing our business as part of a dynamic ecosystem, which includes suppliers of ours, it includes customers, it includes our customers' customers, it includes the communities we work around, it includes the country and the country dynamics, it includes the feed-in institutions like the banks and the funding houses. It feeds in the greater African continent and the influences of the behavior there, and even the global economic environment. So all of these things are made up of a multitude of interlinking little systems, and right down to the granular level of you as a sales or revenue generator in an organization with your direct customer, and it cascades right up to a global view. So this whole ecosystems thinking most certainly forces you to think a lot wider, and think beyond just the sort of linear relationship between your organization and its immediate customer base. So the whole ecosystem theory is something which I'm using a lot, and systems thinking using a lot in my day-to-day current job. And I think it's already starting to bear fruits in terms of how we view our business and how wide the horizons are when you start viewing at this the system as a holistic, interlinked thing, instead of bits and pieces of individual things that are not really linked. Now, turning to the entrepreneurial space, I think the first element that is critical to that ecosystem, and we touched on it in that metacognitive model, was the ecosystem in which the entrepreneurs operate. So outside of the entrepreneur and the specific venture he's trying to tackle, where and what is happening in the South African context with regards the development of entrepreneurs and enabling of entrepreneurs. And those are factors which are extremely limiting right now. And another factor that we can pull into the discussion talks to the corruption and the fact that the corrupt society we live in now is negatively impacting one of the critical elements in terms of that metacognitive model and the whole entrepreneurial ecosystem talks to the education. It talks to the education of our people. And in the corrupt society, the education and the health systems are usually the ones that suffer first in terms of the redirection of funds, the corrupt politicians and people in the processes far more readily channel money towards capital projects where corruption is a lot easier than in the education or health system. So corruption, a reality of the South African ecosystem, and a reality that's affecting the entrepreneurs within the South African ecosystem. So yeah, looking at the next level of interaction is the globalization as part of that whole ecosystem view. And we spoke a bit earlier in the Israeli mindset point of view, that whole global view, and that the ecosystem and the globalization and entrepreneurship specifically talk to each other within the sort of corporate entrepreneurship, where organizations are looking to globalize at a rapid rate, but they need that flexibility in terms of exploring the entrepreneurial traits, while in the same token retaining some sort of structure to harness the globalization. Now again, that whole ecosystem scenario, again, critical in terms of understanding where to globalize and how to globalize. It is really important in terms of understanding where the expansion is, and again, a view which we mentioned earlier of the world not only as a relationship in South Africa or even down to Johannesburg or Gauteng and your direct customer base, but a far wider view. Another benefit and another advantage of viewing this entrepreneurial landscape as an ecosystem is the knowledge spillovers and growth opportunities. Now, it's almost a self-fulfilling prophecy, and we spoke about the dire need for entrepreneurship to generate wealth. But if one looks at the successful ecosystems where entrepreneurship has been around for a long time, like Israel, where there's an entrepreneurship type culture, there's that supporting entrepreneurship ecosystem, there are most certainly knowledge spillovers and growth within regions. I mean, it's as these entrepreneurs become more successful, so the ecosystem supporting entrepreneurs becomes stronger. There's a much greater growth of knowledge and experience within the environment and within that ecosystem. And that boosts the entrepreneur for tomorrow. And so, as I say, it's a cascading effect to a positive, and it creates a significant impact and benefit for a region when the entrepreneurship and the entrepreneurial culture has been supported and has grown over time. One sees a significant benefit in terms of the wealth and prosperity and the education levels and the well-being of the environment and the immediate environment around that. That whole ecosystem then just feeds off this entrepreneur type mindset, and the entrepreneur type mindset feeds off society. So it's a sort of a self-fulfilling prophecy and a positive upward cascading of the success of entrepreneurship. I'd like to have a look at two electives that really stuck with me in terms of the journey. as the second last chapter of this reflective journal. Two electives that really stuck with me and really made an impact on me were firstly the entrepreneurial finance, where we got to interact with angel investors, venture capitalist fund managers, and companies. And I think that's always in my mind been the biggest stumbling block and the first and foremost takeaway point when starting any business is where's the money going to come from? And you spend a whole lot of time around focusing on the finances and making sure that your financial projections are in place and all the hypotheses and scenarios and assumptions are in place. And it was quite enlightening to hear firsthand from these guys that the amount of money is actually the most insignificant element that they look at. And that the first and foremost viewpoint of most angel investors and venture capitalists is that they back teams, don't back individuals. And I think they have a very valid point in terms of individuals. Almost never possible to have all the characteristics and traits required to make a successful go of a new venture or a startup. So the first element that these venture capitalists or angel investors look at is the team. Who is the team? Are they capable of doing this? What does the experience look like? What is the mindset and attitude? And that from there determines whether they look at the four other factors that are key in their decision making in and around getting investing or not. The second element that they have a look at is the timing. And I think that's really important, and especially in the technology era that we live in today, we've heard many stories of big successes of things like Facebook and Uber and the like, that were the fifth or sixth or seventh iteration of the same idea. Just the others were too early in terms of when they took this thing to market, and they failed. So it is the team, it is the timing, it is the relevance of your solution. Is it something that will sell in the market? Then the next element is scalability. How big can you make this thing? Is it a regional, national, global scenario? And then the final element is the actual amount of money. So how much money are you looking for, and what sort of return can the venture capitalist get out of that? So a significant takeaway point: money always has seemed to be the stumbling block in my mind around entrepreneurship. And of course, there was also always this perception that, well, one goes to banks to find money, and it was quite enlightening to understand that funding life cycle of an organization, starting at bootstrapping and all the way through to listing the company and all the steps in between, with banks and banking institutions right near the end of that life cycle. There are a number of other places where you can find funding, and funding actually in the bigger picture of things is not irrelevant, but it is one of the lesser important things when it comes to investors looking to invest in a business or not. So that was the first elective that I found really insightful and really valuable for me in terms of my development and takeaway points out of this process of the MBA journey. The second elective, which was also very insightful, was operationalizing strategy. And I think that's something which is critical to entrepreneurship, is that many people have great ideas, but very few actually act on these things, partly because of that metacognitive mindset model we spoke about earlier, where there's hesitancy and there's lack of experience, and therefore there's a reluctance to act, especially if circumstances aren't driving you in that direction. If you have some sort of safety net on which you're sitting, like sitting in a corporate environment and wanting to become an entrepreneur, there's most certainly a reluctance to undo the umbilical cord, if you want to call it that, and take a leap over into the entrepreneurship space. So, that is the one element. And then the other element is we just don't know how, outside of the fear of, we just don't know how to operationalize a strategy and how all the parts fit together. And the operationalizing strategy elective was really insightful in terms of the model which was shared with us, um, in that everything sort of works back from the customer. It's actually quite logical if one thinks about it. Everything works back from the customer, and the value proposition, which is derived from the customer's need and influenced by the company strategy. And from there, you you work it back into the operations of the organization, looking at the systems and procedures, and that again influences the type of people you need to deliver through that operational system the value propositions which you've developed through the need identifying with the customer and the strategy of the organization. So again, a really relevant element in terms of the entrepreneurship, because we have that great idea, that value proposition, or we believe we have the value proposition. It's about how we test that value proposition, how we create a company that talks to a strategy in and around that value proposition, and then how do we build that organization? How do you put the systems and procedures in place, and how do you employ the people to to enable the delivery of that value proposition and the generation of revenue and profit. So, two elements which are really key for me. It's the whole entrepreneurial finance thing, and where we find money and what's important in terms of investors. And secondly was the implementation of the strategies. How do we actually get this business idea that we are thinking about into momentum? Right, let's have a look at the business plan, and I think the backbone of the journey for me, for the last 2 years now. For many of the others on the entrepreneurial stream, it was an idea that was born recently. But my business plan was based on a concept and idea which was generated through last year, as I said earlier in the video, in the Applied Business Project, and it looks to deliver a platform, a technology platform, or an app as it's aptly called these days, in the e-commerce space, and it allows live end-to-end tracking. So not going to divulge too much about the app and the functionality, but I'd like to reflect on that journey of actually taking a concept and an idea and a very high level business plan, and then evolving it into a very, very detailed business plan this year, which involved prototyping, it involved an investor's pitch, and then it involves quite a detailed business plan as three of the submissions directly linked to that business idea. And I'd like to just reflect on some of the learnings that came out of that. A really insightful process, and again reflects and talks back to that metacognitive mindset model to say that these things can be learned. Entrepreneurship doesn't happen by accidents. Business don't get formed by accident. There's a clear, well thought through, well documented process that needs to be followed. And again, that going back to that whole ecosystem that we spoke about earlier, these are the kinds of trainings and educations that should be residing in and around our primary, secondary, and tertiary education institutions. Is that that students at a very young age get exposed to this process and system, and that they gain experience and confidence in the system and process to ensure that A, there's knowledge, and B, there's experience when it comes to really getting involved post-school, post-tertiary education, and that allows you to scale and operate successful entrepreneurial ventures. So in terms of the process, as I said, very straightforward, very well documented, and quite logical in the journey of how you go along with it. And I think this program was really valuable, and a really good idea in terms of GIBS, and adding this to the MBA journey, because it really allowed me an opportunity to focus valuable hours on something with a significant amount of guidance from the side in terms of how it should be structured, what the journey should look like, what are the sequential steps, what are some influences along the journey that one can get exposed to. So a really valuable journey, and I think this gets followed shortly by a little video clip that highlights that functionality and just shows you what one of the outputs are in terms of this journey of the entrepreneurial stream. This brings me to the end of the reflective journal. Uh, what a spectacular journey this has been. A really privilege to have been part of this journey over the last 2 years at GIBS. Really gained some valuable insight out of the academics and lecturers, but also from the class interaction and engagement with syndicate members and fellow cohort members. Spectacular journey, very enriching, very humbling, and also likewise the journey on the entrepreneurial stream has been phenomenal. Thank you to Jonathan Marks and the rest of the team that put this together. It really has been a privilege to be part of the learning and growing exercise for GIBS in and around offering this entrepreneurial stream as an alternative to the final submission. May this grow from strength to strength, and I would like to thank everybody in the process for contributing to my growth and my development out of this. Thank you.